So we are starting today again. Today we go a little bit back in history, but only 50 years. And we have Professor Harold James with us. He's an authority in history and economic history, and a good friend of mine. And he will talk about the death of Bretton Woods. Probably would call it more elegantly. Harold, the floor is yours, and we're looking forward to his presentation explaining what happened 50 years ago.
Thank you so much, Marcus. Can you all hear me, or does this do anything? Yes, it does. It's great to be with you. I wanted to reflect on an event 50 years ago, just over 50 years ago, on the 15th of August, 1971. But I also wanted to situate it in terms of what you've been thinking about, I think, and what you're thinking about this weekend. In terms of the big story of money. When we think of the big story of money, we really think in the recent periods that it's all about the US dollar. And some people are unhappy with that. Increasingly, you hear appeals that it needs something better to replace it. El Salvador's just done this experiment with making Bitcoin legal tender. But this event 50 years ago was a real turning point in terms of the way in which the US dollar was at the center of the international monetary system. Before that, the US dollar was at the center of the international monetary system in that the system devised in 1944, in the summer of 1944, at the conference of the United Nations in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, had required countries to declare a par value of their currency, and they could then fluctuate by 1% either way, relative to either gold or the US dollar. And in practice, almost every country chose, I think every country chose to take a dollar parity. And so the dollar was really right at the center of this fixed exchange rate world. And the dollar was promised to be convertible to gold at $35 an ounce. So there's a kind of legacy with the thousands of years of history in which coins and money were defined in terms of a physical unit of precious metal, of gold or silver, or sometimes other metals, copper. So it goes back a long way. And after the 15th of August, 1971, there isn't that backing in terms of precious metals. It produces a substantial nostalgia in the 1970s and 1980s, and some newspapers, the Times in London or the Wall Street Journal in the United States, have big campaigns to think that gold should be returned to its role at the center of the international monetary system, but it isn't. And what you have, though, is a world in which the kind of money really shifts, and it's something I think you've probably heard a lot about, the distinction between inside money and outside money. So the outside money, the classical form of that is this, gold is outside the monetary system. But that becomes less important, and inside money is much more important. And it's inside money that really gives you the story of the next 50 years. So I wanted to think this morning, first of all, about the background to the 15th of August, 1971, why it was done, why President Nixon makes this big statement. This is a television address, which took all the other countries by surprise. They weren't tipped off about this in advance. The International Monetary Fund, which was supposed to be at the center of the administration of the fixed exchange rate system, the managing director of the IMF, Pierre-Paul Schweitzer, was just called in and saw the televised address in the office of the US Treasury Secretary. So there was no consultation. This was a very, very unilateral bit of action. And it was made up, really, decided just a few days before in a dramatic crisis weekend discussion in Camp David, in the president's compound in Camp David. So first of all, I want to think, why did they do this? And then more importantly, I want to think about the consequences. And at the end, I want to think about what happens now, because it seems to me that we're in some ways in a kind of similar moment. And this kind of unilateralism of the United States that provoked a great deal of reaction and criticism is almost now the default mode of the United States. I mean, certainly under the Trump administration, but there's quite a lot of it that continues into the Biden administration. So first of all, then, the background to this. The background is the anxiety through the 1960s that this kind of dollar standard is not adequate to the requirements of an expanding world economy. And the criticism is put, I think, in a nice formula, really stated already in the late 1950s by the Belgian economist Robert Triffen. So it's known as the Triffen Dilemma. And it's this, that the world requires money in order to operate. So you need to make sure that there's enough money for the world to operate. And during the gold standard, there were continuous worries about that. And in the interwar period, people had said, well, there's a problem in that the world economy is expanding in a geometric way, whereas we get a kind of arithmetic addition every year to the world stock of gold. And so the reliance on gold is likely to push you into deflation. So the question was, how do you make sure that you have exactly the right amount of money in this system? And the Triffen Dilemma said, well, there's an enormous risk of either doing too little, in which case there's going to be a shortage of liquidity and you will get the deflationary problems that affected the world in the interwar period, or there may be too much liquidity created in the United States, in which case you may have a classical type of bank run. Because if you get a lot of dollar claims building up and people are aware of the limited amount of gold that's stored in Fort Knox or in the vaults deep down in the granite under Manhattan, under the enormous amount of gold at the time kept in the office of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. You used to be able to go and see it, actually. So if the claims build up relative to the limited amount of gold, somebody will realize that there's not enough gold to back up the claims, and there will be a bank run on it. And in effect, something like that had happened. Actually, we're in a nice year for round dates, because it's almost exactly now 90 years since this event, since the 20th of September, 1931, when exactly that happened to the British pound, which was in effect the equivalent in the 19th century, and then after the First World War, when it's restored, the British pound is still at the center of things. But in September 1931, there was an awareness that the gold stocks of the Bank of England were really very limited, and there were a large number of sterling claims And so people started to convert sterling into gold. So there was an awareness that there's a possibility of a run. So this is a system that you really can't win. If you don't do enough in terms of dollar creation, there's a liquidity constraint and a deflationary problem. If you do too much, you're going to get into a crisis of confidence. And so the criticism was formulated in the following way, that the US dollar was like a celebrated dud car of the period, the Corvair, that it was unsafe at any speed. The consumer advocate Ralph Nader had a big piece on this car, unsafe at any speed. And so the idea was that the dollar was unsafe at any speed. So there's a general problem about this system. And in the late 1950s, when Triffen originally formulated the critique, there was an idea that maybe you could solve it by altering the gold price. And for instance, one proposal that was quite seriously debated was to double the price of gold, to make it $70 an ounce rather than $35 an ounce. But that might be destabilizing, because you can't do that and then think it's going to be permanent. And so, in effect, if you did that, you would be moving to a system probably not unlike the system that you in the end got out with the 1970s. So the debate goes on during the 1960s, and it in some ways has a partial resolution in that there's a very, very hesitant move to creating some composite reserve unit as a substitute for the dollar through what's oddly designated as the special drawing right of the IMF. And that was originally designed to be an alternative to the dollar as a reserve unit. And it probably wouldn't have come to an acute crisis if it hadn't been for the worry in the United States about a loss of competitive position because the United States was looking at increasing trade deficits, and in particular increasing trade deficits relative with two countries, with Japan and with West Germany. So the question was, how could you deal with this? And it looked to Americans, and particularly to Congress, as if these surges of imports from Japan and Germany were leading to the loss of American jobs. And so there was something of a loss of jobs debate and globalization debate of the kind that we're much more familiar with now, I think, since 2000 with China. The same kind of discussion. How can you stop this happening? And how can you get Japan or Germany to change their exchange rates so that their goods become more expensive and Americans don't buy so much of them? And the idea was that Germany and Japan were really breaking the rules of the international system in some way, in forcing exports onto the world in order to maintain a high level of employment at the cost of other countries. So the debate about that was, in a sense, a very modern debate. But it made the United States feel particularly powerless because every other country could have a discussion about its exchange rate. It, after all, fixed the exchange rate relative to the dollar. But the United States couldn't have a discussion about its exchange rate at all because it was there. So, you know, that problem is sometimes called the N-1 problem. You're really stuck. You need to do, the only way of reforming the system, of changing the system, is to do something very violent and very destructive, and to blow up the system at all. So, you know, maybe President Nixon was right not to do the consultations with all the other countries. After all, they tried that. They pushed Germany to change the parity of the German mark in 1969. They pushed Japan, but Japan wouldn't do it, to change the parity of the yen in 1971. So you're really stuck. What can you possibly do? What's the room for maneuver there? And that's the context in which the decision of the 15th of August is born. And Nixon says in the speech, this televised speech, that he's going to do this for three reasons. First of all, to create more American jobs. So that's the number one reason. It's an alternative to a permanent move to protection. Actually, on the 15th of August, Nixon also announces temporary import surcharges. So there is a measure to trade protection that goes along with this. And so the first idea is we create more American jobs. And then the second theme of Nixon's speech is that this is a way of stopping price increases and stabilizing the cost of living, because there was already a discussion of some kind of level of inflation at this moment that was pushed by the monetary expansion in the late 1960s and pushed by a big fiscal action, both in terms of military spending overseas for the Vietnam War and for the social reconstruction program of the Great Society. So there was inflation in the United States, and that also is what made people outside the United States more unhappy about this system. In Europe, in Germany, they're worried about inflation. They think that the United States is pushing inflation onto the world. In France, people ask, why is the world setting its clock, its watch, to a defective clock to the United States? There's a worry about inflation, and there's a worry among American consumers about inflation. Nixon promises to do something about that. And finally, Nixon says this is targeted also against the international currency speculators. So it's going to curtail speculation. And there's a lot of language in the speech. I mean, I can read bits of it if you want. It says this fixed exchange rate system has produced constant crises. Who gains from these crises? Not the working man, not the investor, not the real producers of wealth. The gainers are the international money speculators. Because they thrive on crises, they help to create them. And if you think about those three promises, create more American jobs, first of all, create more American jobs, stabilize American prices, and fight international speculation, you have to say that Nixon failed abysmally on all of these, because the rate of unemployment increased dramatically through the 1970s. The rate of inflation increased. We got what in this country is known as the Great Inflation. in the 1970s, and international speculation, wow, it really took off in the 1970s. And there was an element really of mendacity about the whole Nixon performance. In the past, when countries devalued, it looked like a defeat. It felt like a humiliation. That was particularly the case in the United Kingdom. I still remember the devaluation in 1967 that the British government did. That was a colossal humiliation, defeat. But Nixon used almost exactly the same kind of language that the British government used in 1967 to explain it. And he said, let me lay to rest the bugaboo of what is called devaluation. If you want to buy a foreign car or take a trip abroad, market conditions may cause your dollar to buy slightly less. But if you are among the overwhelming majority of Americans who buy American-made products in America, your dollar will be worth just as much tomorrow as it is today. The effect of this action, in other words, will be to stabilize the dollar. What the British Prime Minister Harold Wilson had said in 1967, from now on, the pound abroad is worth 14% or so less in terms of other currencies. That doesn't mean, of course, that the pound here in Britain, in your pocket or your purse or in your bank, has been devalued. Well, that was a nonsense in Britain. It was slightly less of a nonsense in the United States, in that the United States is a bigger economy, and so it's less open, and it's less sensitive to changes in import prices. But the story of big levels of inflation going ahead in the middle of the 1970s is one that really follows from this, because it makes the conduct of monetary policy much more politicized. And it's worth thinking, I think, about the origins of the Great Inflation. So many people will think that the Great Inflation followed from the big oil price increases in 1973. In 1973, the petroleum price almost quadrupled, between 3 and 4 times increase. But that actually is an outcome rather than a cause of anything. It's an outcome of a world economy that was overheating and consuming more energy and consuming more commodities in general, more food in general. So there were food crises, commodity price shocks in the 1970s, and the oil producers were just reacting to a market situation that allowed them to do this. Otherwise, if there hadn't been the demand for petroleum, they wouldn't have been able to get away with this increase. It's a remarkable story in terms of the initial policies pursued, because they look so misguided from the perspective of a modern person looking at them. So when the oil price increases, instead of allowing that to take place, there are attempts to hold down the oil price in the United States. And so the oil price remains relatively low. People consume more, and the consequence is that there are gasoline shortages. And then instead of trying to ration by increasing the price, they ration by just restricting the amount available. And so other things don't get delivered, and you don't get food. Then there's petroleum allocated to necessary producers, but who decides what a necessary producer is? Truck drivers weren't allocated enough fuel, and so the grocery stores don't get their supplies coming in. it leads to a decade of really profoundly destabilizing economic policy. And it's only in the late 1970s that the Federal Reserve turns around, and inflation becomes a major theme in all the elections from the middle of the 1970s. But it's very, very difficult. The initial story is that you need a bit more inflation because it will deliver a bit more growth. And indeed, some people, some economists at that point, are making the argument that if you have a bit more inflation that produces more growth, you will produce more goods, and so you will decrease the price in the end. And so the way to fight inflation is to produce more monetary stimulus. And that was an argument that was particularly popular in the UK, where the outcome was even worse than in the United States, but it was popular in the United States as well. And you can sometimes hear echoes of that kind of argument in contemporary discussions, that you need a bit more growth, and if you have a bit more growth, you will satisfy all the demands. So this was the background of the 1970s. Let me highlight the most peculiar feature of it all. So the dollar, which some people had thought was being dethroned as a result of the Nixon action, the dollar comes to be more central for the international system rather than less central. And that's because the big imbalances that build up after the oil price shock in particular, what happens to the funds that the oil producers get from the increased price, and they're not going to be able to spend it immediately, that's recycled through the banking system. And it's actually a pretty deliberate maneuver on the part of the United States. The initial reaction to the oil price increases is it's very, very frightened. This seems to be undermining the basis of Western societies. Shouldn't there be military action? And the first of the what then becomes a regular yearly event, the summits of the big industrial powers. The original one was G5 in 1975 in Rambouillet in France. What becomes then the G7 or the G8. At the first of these summits, the chief American foreign policy spokesman, Henry Kissinger, is then Secretary of State, it says, don't think of going to war with the oil producers and using military action against them. You just let them buy into the system, and that they will, if they have enough money in the big American banks that are internationalizing themselves, they'll have an interest in preserving the system rather than in overthrowing it. So that's the way of binding them in. It's a neat strategic vision, but it's what really produces this big expansion of the internationalization of banking in the 1970s and all around the US dollar. So in 1970, before all of this happens, Robert Mundell has a very, very neat little article that he publishes in a rather obscure journal in Geneva. But I love to cite it because he says things in this article in 1970. He makes predictions of the future, and mostly when people make predictions about the future, they're really terrible. And you know, who knows what the future is going to bring? You know, most predictions are terrible. But if you look at this thing, it says, you know, there are three things, three big issues. First of all, don't think that there's going to be a crisis of the US dollar. The US dollar will be at the center of the international monetary system for my lifetime. Secondly, the Europeans are going to get a single currency, in part because of this continued preeminence of the US dollar. So the European currency will be an answer to the predominance of the dollar. Indeed, I think historically, that's absolutely right, that in particular, the most extreme phase of the dollar inflation in the late 1970s was what pushed France and Germany to move to get a European monetary system, a kind of fixed exchange rate regime, a replication of the Bretton Woods order in Europe. That was one of the stepping stones that went towards the creation of the common currency. And finally, the Soviet Union will collapse. So, you know, nobody in the 1970s really thought any of these things were likely to happen. Europe looked hopelessly divided. The Soviet Union looked as if it was the beneficiary of the American collapse. And the US dollar looked very, very feeble. So, you know, this, yeah, a quick question. Yeah, it's a great point, and people really thought about that. So, you know, in the 1960s, when it came to inventing this alternative to the dollar, the IMF special drawing right, it was at first conceived as exactly equivalent to a dollar. It was just another way of doing that, except it wasn't a liability in the United States. In the 1970s, after the end of the Bretton Woods system, the special drawing right is then redesigned as a basket for currencies, but it's not really ever really a usable currency. It's only accessible to central banks. You can't make payments in it. I mean, I suppose somebody could synthetically have an equivalent financial instrument to an SDR, but the United States was constantly trying to lean against any attempt to really make the SDR an international currency. And then, you know, the story of it is interesting because in the in 2008, in the aftermath of the global financial crisis, you know, all these ideas come back again, and in particular, the governor of the People's Bank of China, Governor Zhu, pushes this idea again and again in speeches, but it doesn't get anywhere either. So the dollar remains absolutely at the center. The Europeans did try to push a synthetic basket currency, and you get some use of the, it's called the European Currency Unit, the ECU, in the 1980s. So there are issues on the capital market in ECUs in the 1980s, but they're tiny, tiny compared to the issues in dollars or in conventional national currencies in Deutschmark or French francs. So, you know, without the move to the common currency, you know, that does produce a European capital market, you know, this this idea of having a basket currency, because you can see that a basket currency is potentially vulnerable in moments of stress, and I think that's there's an interesting discussion of why this ECU didn't really take off in the 1980s. So indeed, I mean, the background to this is the development of an offshore dollar market, and the background to that is in the 1960s, interest rates were controlled in the United States. So the Depression era legislation that put a ceiling on interest rates was still in place, but you could borrow and lend in dollars outside the United States and not be subject to that Federal Reserve limitation. And so in the 60s, the offshore dollar market, or the term for it is the Eurodollar market, develops quite substantially, and so it's used to do bond issues. But it's really in the 1970s that really takes off, and that has in turn to do with the first issue of financialization. So you might want to just stop here and think that this is a kind of perfect world, but it seems to me actually that it's really changing now again, and so it might be, and if you take the Mundell story seriously, he says, well, the dollar will be the main currency of the international system through my lifetime. Well, he died quite recently. So it does seem to me that there is actually quite a lot of change in the air at the moment, and I think the story is one so it goes back in a way to the 1970s discussion about the link between the use of the dollar and security. If you use the dollar, you tie yourself into the security system. The use of the dollar as a means of payment, it can be used in particular for sanctions against rogue states. And it worked pretty effectively against North Korea. But when it comes to doing sanctions against Russia or even Iran, these are much more interconnected economies. And the consequence is that the people who deal with Russia or Iran will look for alternatives that don't depend on the US dollar or on the clearing systems that the US dollar uses, the payment systems, the SWIFT. Part of the sense of the move away from the US dollar is, I think, driven by the overextension of sanctions. Sanctions you can use effectively against a small country, but against a bigger internationally connected country. Secondly, I think in the possibility of alternative forms of currency now, you can think of non-dollar ways of doing things. And Marcus has written very extensively about this, so Marcus can probably tell you much more about this. But it looks in particular as if countries that don't necessarily have very strong or stable or credible governments or credible monetary institutions may think of digital currencies as an alternative to nationally issued currencies. I mean, obviously also some countries that have bad institutions will try to get onto the bandwagon. So Venezuela tried to do exactly this exercise. But if you look in Central Asia, there's an enormous use of digital currencies, and digital currencies look like a good alternative to a national currency that may not be really very credible, and to an international currency that is subject to all these big political concerns. So it really might be that we're coming to the end of this dollar era as well. And the fundamental insight, I think, is that technology gives you a way of making new alternatives to the existing system that didn't exist when Richard Nixon was speaking in August 1971. The technology of distributed ledgers, and sometimes people like to make an analogy between the use of money and the use of language. It sort of gets a bit to the question of why you need one currency, and why this first question that I thought was absolutely right, why Mandel should think it's a good idea to have one currency, because it's complicated and difficult to translate currencies into each other, and you lose a lot by doing that. The technology wasn't at all good at doing that. The technology is much better now, and you might think that in the same way as you can have automatic translation now, and you can use Google Translate or other mechanisms very effectively to translate from one language to another. So I could be speaking in English, and you could be listening to this in Farsi or Mandarin. That you can use technology to get really multiple currencies and multiple languages that are intelligible to each other and can communicate with each other relatively effectively and costlessly, and avoid all the costs that you have in going to a single language. Because obviously also I mean, I think the language analogy isn't a bad one there. It's painful and cumbersome for people whose native language is not English to have to always do English when they want to do anything in an international setting, and it's painful and irritating, and you're dependent on all kinds of intermediaries to use the dollar. And so when El Salvador does this exercise, it's in part, I think, driven by the idea that there are lots of El Salvadorians abroad who need to make remittances, and if they don't have bank accounts, remittances are a very cumbersome and expensive way of doing things, and so there's a cheaper way of doing it. So the technology might really hold out the option of doing things differently. And this may be a 50-year era. And if you want, finally, one final thought that I thought I would leave you with as a kind of augury of this. This was intensely connected with security, and the story of why this is necessary is to do with the end of the Vietnam conflict and the commitment of the United States in Southeast Asia. So it's exactly 50 years after President Nixon's speech on the 15th of August, 2021, that the Taliban surprisingly and unexpectedly quickly take Kabul. And that moment, the chaotic end of the US presence in Afghanistan, I think will be commemorated in the same way as the 15th of August, 1971, as the end of an era. So, this was a 50-year interplay. We're now in an era in which there is something else, and in which we're reimagining both language and money. Thank you.